It is the 7th of September 1936. One of the greatest tragedies in Australian wildlife is about to occur. The last of its kind died alone, without knowing it was the last of its lineage. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no crowd. The zookeepers had left it outside, locked out of its shelter, and by morning it was gone. No one filmed its final hours. But a few years earlier, someone had pointed a camera at one of the last surviving members of the species, and that grainy black and white footage is almost all we have left. You can watch it pace the length of a concrete enclosure. You can watch it lie down, scratch at the floor, and open its jaws in an enormous, impossible yawn. And if you did not know what you were looking at, you would assume it was a dog, or a wild cat, or some strange hybrid of the two. It was neither. It was not a dog, and it was not a cat. It was not the tiger that one of its names insists it was, and it was not the wolf that the other name promised. For more than a century, almost everything the world believed about this animal was wrong, and the wrongness was not a small misunderstanding around the edges. It reached all the way to the center. We were wrong about what it ate. We were wrong about how it hunted. We were wrong about whether it was clumsy, wrong about who truly destroyed it, and wrong, possibly, about whether it is even gone at all. This is the story of how a species was erased by a string of mistakes, and how science spent the decades after its death slowly proving that nearly every reason we gave for killing it was a lie. Let's begin with the names, because the names were the first lie, and they shaped every lie that followed. The animal was the thylacine, Thylacine cynocephalus, and it was a marsupial, a carnivorous marsupial, roughly the size of a large dog with a stiff tail, a pouch, and a series of dark stripes running across its lower back. Those stripes earned it one name, the Tasmanian tiger, and its long, narrow, dog-like snout earned it the other, the marsupial wolf. Both names pointed at familiar placental predators, at tigers and wolves, animals shaped on entirely different branches of the mammalian family tree. And that resemblance was the trap. Because the thylacine looked like a wolf, people assumed it lived like a wolf, hunted like a wolf, and threatened them like a wolf. The shape was real. The conclusions drawn from that shape were almost entirely false, and the gap between the two would cost the species everything. Look closer at the body, the name's ignored, and the disguise falls apart almost immediately. Beneath the dog-like silhouette, the thylacine was built on a blueprint no placental predator has ever shared. Both sexes possessed a pouch, something never seen before, and furthermore, it opened backward. The female raised her young in hers, while the male possessed a partial pouch of his own, a fold of skin that protected his hindquarters as he moved through the thick brush. Its tail was more like a kangaroo's, thick at the base and completely stiff without the ability to wag. It could even rise briefly onto its hind legs, balancing in a way no wolf could manage. Its jaws, its gait, its pouch, its entire developmental story belonged to the marsupial line, a lineage that had split away from the ancestors of wolves and tigers well over 100 million years ago. The stripes and the snout were a coincidence of surface. Everything underneath told a completely different story, and almost no one was looking. To understand how a misunderstanding became an extermination, you have to go back to the moment the two worlds collided. When European settlers arrived in Tasmania in the early 19th century, they brought sheep, and they built an economy on wool. And when sheep began turning up dead, the settlers looked around for a culprit, and their eyes landed on the strange striped predator slipping through the bush at the edge of their farms. It looked dangerous. It looked like a wolf. That was enough. The story wrote itself almost instantly. Here was a ruthless killer of livestock, a beast that needed to be wiped out before it ruined them. By the 1830s, the hunts had begun in earnest. Private bounties came first, and then, between 1888 and 1909, the Tasmanian government itself paid a reward for every dead thylacine brought in. Men were paid by the head to erase a species, and they did the job thoroughly. They shot them, trapped them, and poisoned them across the island, year after year, until the animal that had once ranged through Tasmania's forests became a rumor, then a ghost, then a single specimen behind a fence. The scale of it is preserved in the paperwork. A private land company had paid bounties on the animal since the 1830s, and when the colonial government formalized its own scheme in 1888, it offered a full pound for every dead adult and 10 shillings for every pup, a price that quietly turned a living species into currency. More than 2,000 of those bounties were claimed before the payments finally stopped, and they stopped for the bleakest reason imaginable. There were almost none left to bring in. Hunting may not even have finished the job by itself. In the early years of the 20th century, a disease, possibly a distemper-like epidemic, appears to have moved through the survivors, hollowing out a population that was already being pushed to the edge by guns, traps, and the steady loss of its habitat. The campaign worked. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most complete, deliberate exterminations in modern history. And here is where the first and most devastating reversal begins, because the entire justification for that campaign rested on something Thylacine could not actually do. For most of the 20th century, the image of the sheep-slaughtering Thylacine went unchallenged. It was simply assumed. Then, in 2011, a team of researchers at the University of New South Wales decided to test it directly. They took detailed scans of Thylacine skulls and built computer models of them, then ran those models through a technique borrowed from engineering called finite element analysis, the same method used to test whether a bridge or an aircraft frame will hold under stress. The question was, how much force the Thylacine's skull and jaw could actually withstand. In an instant, an entire century of accusations went down the drain. The Thylacine skull was simply too weak. The long, elegant jaw that looked so much like a wolf's could not generate or absorb the forces required to bring down large, struggling prey. An adult sheep would have been beyond its reach. The truth that came to light after the studies was that it was an animal built to hunt much smaller targets. Wallabies, possums, bandicoots, and birds were its usual prey. Targets it could subdue without risking the fragile architecture of its own head. The scraps of evidence we have about what Thylacines actually ate point the same way, toward birds and small mammals rather than the torn carcasses of sheep, and modern reassessments of the old farming records suggest the animal was repeatedly blamed for kills that feral dogs and the settlers' own neglect were far more likely to have caused. Sit with what that means. The Thylacine was hunted to extinction for slaughtering livestock, and the best modern science we have indicates it was biologically incapable of the crime. We exterminated an entire species for a murder it could not have committed. The animal the farmers feared was a fiction, and the real Thylacine, the one that actually existed, died paying for it. If the first myth was about what it ate, the second was about how it killed, and it falls apart for the same underlying reason. Because the Thylacine looked like a wolf, it was imagined to behave like one, which meant hunting in coordinated packs, running prey to exhaustion across open ground, a relentless social predator working as a team. It is a vivid image, and it is almost certainly wrong. The behavioral records we have, sparse as they are, along with what we can infer from its biology, point to a solitary animal, one that hunted alone or perhaps in pairs, ambushing prey in the dense Tasmanian undergrowth rather than chasing it down in a pack across the plains. The wolf was a story we projected onto a body that happened to share its outline. And that outline, that uncanny resemblance, is one of the most striking examples of a phenomenon called convergent evolution, where two completely unrelated animals, separated by tens of millions of years and an entire continent, arrive at nearly the same design because they are solving the same problem. The placental wolf of the northern hemisphere and the marsupial Thylacine of the south both evolved into lean, long-jawed pursuit predators, and they came to resemble each other so closely that their skulls can be difficult to tell apart at a glance. But the resemblance is skin deep. Underneath, the Thylacine carried a pouch and a marsupial's ancient lineage, and it lived by rules its placental look-alike never followed. We saw a wolf, and we never bothered to look past the costume. Which brings us to the third thing we got wrong: the assumption that the Thylacine was a clumsy evolutionary dead end, a poorly designed relic that was always destined to lose. In truth, it carried one of the most remarkable specializations of any mammalian predator that has ever lived, and it was hiding in plain sight in that enormous yawn you can see in the old footage. The Thylacine could open its jaws to an angle of around 80 degrees, possibly more, a gape so extreme that almost no other mammal predator comes close. A wolf, for comparison, opens its jaws to roughly 45 or 50 degrees. The Thylacine could very nearly double that. This was not the mouth of a failure. It was the mouth of a highly specialized animal, refined over millions of years for a particular way of feeding and gripping, perfectly suited to the niche it occupied. The same jaw that was too weak to kill a sheep was, in its own context, an exquisite piece of biological engineering. The Thylacine was not waiting to go extinct. It was not a mistake limping toward the exit. It was a finely tuned predator built for a specific world, and that distinction matters enormously because it means the Thylacine did not fail. The world it was built for was taken away from it. And that leads directly to the fourth reversal, the one that rewrites the entire timeline of its death. Here is the version of the story almost everyone believes. The Thylacine was an Australian animal, thriving across the land, till European settlers arrived and wiped it out within a century. It is a clean, satisfying narrative with clear villains and a clear ending. It is also, in its broad strokes, wrong. The Thylacine had already vanished from mainland Australia roughly 3,000 years before the British ever arrived. For most of its history, it ranged across the whole continent and into New Guinea, but somewhere around 3,000 years ago, it disappeared from everywhere except one place. The leading explanation points to the dingo, the wild dog introduced to Australia a few thousand years earlier, which may have outcompeted the Thylacine across the mainland, combined with shifting climate and growing human pressure. The dingo never reached Tasmania, separated from the mainland by the cold waters of Bass Strait, and so Tasmania became the Thylacine's final refuge, the last island where an ancient lineage could hold on. By the time Europeans and settlers arrived with their sheep and their bounties, they were not encountering a flourishing species. They were encountering the last survivors of an animal that had already lost almost its entire range millennia before any of them were born. The mainland extinction was prehistoric. What the colonists destroyed was the remnant, the final holdout, the last fragile thread of a story that had been unraveling for 3,000 years. What happened to that final remnant in its last decades is documented with painful precision. By the opening of the 20th century, the bounty had done most of its work, and the Thylacine was disappearing from the Tasmanian bush faster than anyone seemed willing to notice. The last one ever shot in the wild fell in 1930, killed by a farmer named Wilf Batty when the animal wandered onto his property, an ordinary afternoon that turned out to be the closing of a door no one realized was closing. After that, the species existed only in captivity, in a handful of zoos where the animals lived out their days behind wire, refusing to breed, quietly running down like clocks no one had thought to win. One by one they died, until a single individual remained in Hobart, the last thylacine on Earth, pacing the same short stretch of concrete that the old film preserves forever. And then, on that cold September night in 1936, it too was gone. And the species that had outlasted the ice ages ended not with a hunt, but with a locked-out cage and a drop in temperature. And that is the thought that gives this story its terrible weight, the climax that everything has been building toward. Put the numbers together. The Thylacine had survived ice ages. It had survived the arrival of the first humans on the continent. It had endured the slow loss of an entire continental range and retreated against the odds into a single island stronghold where it managed to persist for thousands of additional years. By the time the bounty hunters went to work, they were not hunting a thriving population. They were hunting the last half of 1% of a lineage that had already lost the other 99.5% before a single European set foot in Australia. We did not bring down a healthy species in its prime. We finished off a survivor, the last sliver of something that had clung to existence for far longer than our entire recorded civilization. And we did it for a crime it could not commit based on a resemblance that was never real. The final, almost unbearable detail is one of timing. The Tasmanian government granted the Thylacine official protection on the 10th of July, 1936. 59 days later, on the 7th of September, the last known Thylacine was dead. Protection arrived for a species that had already been reduced to a single animal in a cage, and it arrived just under 2 months before that animal's death. It was not a rescue. It was an apology delivered to an empty room. Consider how little is left of it now. A scattering of skins and skeletons in museum drawers, a few hundred specimens spread across the world, some preserved pouch young suspended in jars of alcohol, and around 10 short, flickering film clips that together run only a couple of minutes, every one of them shot inside a zoo. That is the entire moving record of a predator that once ranged across an entire continent. The most famous of those clips, filmed in 1933, shows one of the last captives pacing its enclosure, yawning that impossible yawn and snapping at a hand just outside the frame, and in 2021 the footage was painstakingly colorized, finally giving a face in full color to an animal almost everyone had only ever seen in gray. It is a strange and haunting kind of archive, an entire species reduced to a few seconds of film in a row of glass jars. And it should, by every rule we think we understand, be the end of the story. But this is the strange thing about the Thylacine. The reason its story refuses to end the way every other extinction does. It will not stay buried. Since that night in 1936, there have been more than 1,200 reported sightings of living Thylacines, scattered across Tasmania and even mainland Australia. Accounts of striped shapes crossing roads at night and slipping into the trees. Not one of them has ever been confirmed. No body, no clear photograph, no living animal. By every scientific standard, the Thylacine is extinct, and the rational position is that all 1,200 sightings are misidentifications, wishful thinking, or hoaxes. And yet the sightings keep coming, decade after decade, because something about this animal makes people unwilling to accept that it is truly gone. And now, for the first time, that refusal has a foothold in real science. In 2022, researchers at the University of Melbourne, working with the genetics company Colossal Biosciences, announced a serious effort to bring the thylacine back, to reconstruct its genome and, eventually, to engineer a living approximation of the animal we erased. It is the same ambition being pursued with the woolly mammoth, and the thylacine is one of the leading candidates for what is now called de-extinction. The reason it is even conceivable comes back to those preserved bodies in the museum jars, the pickled pups and dried pelts that for decades looked like nothing more than relics. From one of them, a juvenile more than a century old, scientists were able to recover and sequence the animal's genome, a near-complete genetic blueprint of a creature that has been dead since before the Second World War. The plan, in outline, is to take that blueprint together with the genome of the thylacine's closest living relative, a small marsupial called the fat-tailed dunnart that is no larger than a mouse, and then to edit the living animal's DNA, gene by gene, until its cells carry the thylacine's instructions instead. From there, the goal is a living, breathing approximation of the lost predator, grown with the help of a marsupial surrogate. There is something almost vertiginous about it, the blueprint for a dog-sized hunter being rebuilt inside the cells of an animal you could hold in one hand. Whether it can truly be done, and whether it should, is a question scientists and ethicists are still arguing over, and it is a genuinely hard one. So that is the question worth sitting with and worth arguing about. If we have the power to undo one of the extinctions we caused, does that give us the right or simply a new way to get it wrong? It is the kind of question that does not have a clean answer, and we would honestly like to know where you come down on it. Because here's where the names come back around. We called it a tiger, and it was not a tiger. We called it a wolf, and it was not a wolf. For 100 years, we hung borrowed names on an animal we never understood, and then we killed it for a nature it never had. The thylacine spent its entire existence being mistaken for something else, right up until the moment it stopped existing. But its story is no longer only a story about an ending. For the first time since that cold night in Hobart, the question is not just how we lost it, but whether we might somehow find it again. We called it the Tasmanian tiger. Maybe one day, against all reason and all precedent, that name will once again describe something alive. And if the thylacine teaches you anything, it is to be deeply suspicious of the obvious explanation, of the animal that looks like exactly what you assume it is. Because there is another creature in Australia that took that lesson even further, an animal so impossible, so wrong by every rule of biology we had, that when the first specimen reached Europe, the leading scientists of the day were convinced it was a hoax, a fraud stitched together from the parts of other animals. They were wrong about that too. That animal is the platypus, and its story is even stranger than this one.